Betting, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Bet with the Best podcast. Its mission is to explore better ways to bet on races, to seek out new, successful players, and to boldly go where no podcast has gone before.
The Bet with the Best podcast is sponsored by AmWager, an ADW built by horse players for horse players. Speed, power, and ease of use are at the core of AmWager. The platform is packed with features including live video, race replays, conditional wagering, and true odds, a predictive estimate of the off odds that will give you an edge. AmWager gives players the information and tools they need to quickly make anything from a win bet to a complex structured group of pick 5 tickets using the ABC strategy. With a rating of over 4.5 stars on Google, AmWager is a favorite among horse players. Sign up now at amwager.com to take advantage of the simplest sign-up bonus in the business, a 100% first deposit match up to $150. If you want to bet with the best, then you need an edge. You need AmWager.
Welcome to episode 38 of the Bet with the Best podcast. This is part 2 of our conversation with Craig Milkowski, who's the man behind Timeform US Speed and Pace Figures. In part 1, we talked primarily about speed figures. Now we're going to get a little more into the pace figures. So thanks again, Craig, for joining us. Let's pick up where we left off the first time. And now let's talk some about pace figures. You described how you create a speed figure, you adjust that for the track variant, and then you mentioned how you then take that variant and somehow apply it, and you measure things from a pace standpoint and apply that for the pace figure. So maybe just talk a little bit about how you create the pace figures, what they represent, and how they compare to the speed figures. And then you can talk about how you combine those two into kind of a pace-adjusted final time figure that I think is sort of makes Timeform US unique with regards to the at least the commercial figures that are popular and available out there.
Sure. So the pace figure is just, we're looking at the pace time for all the fractions, those ones that pop up on the screen when they're correct. And just like I built the speed chart, for every track, I have a pace chart. And it's more necessary to me to have a different chart for every track. And when I say every track, the inner turf is a different track than the outer turf, and zero rail is different from a 20-foot rail. And so it's basically every circuit, every different way a track can make is going to have different effects on how the paces run, because I'll have different run up at different distances, things like that. So what I do is I'll look at all the races for a track, and I say I look at it, it's the computer and the programs I write are looking at. I'll send like all the Aqueduct dirt races through and say, what is the percentage of time that the average quarter mile takes at 6 furlongs of the final time? And basically that percentage will be the par for pace. So maybe if the average final time at Aqueduct is 1:11 at 6 furlongs and the average quarter mile is 22.5, I just divide 22.5 into 71, or 22.5 divided by 71, and I get 31.69%. So whatever final time is run for a particular race, the time that I would expect the pace to be would be that final time times that percentage. And that's kind of how I come up with a par for the race. One thing that I do a little bit differently, I think for most people, at least in all the books that I read, is I use the pace times of the winner when I make the pars, because generally the winners run the most efficient race. Not saying they ran the most efficient race possible, but they run the most efficient of the horses in the race. And you just get a lot less outliers when you concentrate on the winners, as opposed to some horse who ran off by 15 lengths in the beginning and will totally skew your averages, or some big closer who was 20 lengths behind. And, I just want to look at the horses how do they do when they win? And I do that for every single pace call at every one of those, which is just, like I said, I do every possible combination for dirt and turf. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of them. Dirt, not so much. There's only one dirt track at most places. Now that Aqueduct only has one. I don't think there's anywhere else that has two. Gulfstream obviously has two main tracks, but they're different surfaces, so they wouldn't be lumped together. But when you get to turf, it can be quite daunting. As I'm looking at my list now, I have 516 tracks that I have to keep averages for the pace. And as you might imagine, not all of them have gigantic sample sizes, and we kind of have a way to smooth that out that I've learned over time to make sure, if the sample's too small, we'll look at similar tracks with the same distance and make sure we're in the neighborhood. But that's kind of how we do it. And that's how I built my pace charts, by using those percentages for every single circuit that runs races in North America.
So you don't create a separate variant for the pace. You do it for the final time only, right? And then you adjust the final time based on the variant, and then you compare that to the actual measured time for the pace, and that's how you assign the pace for that horse?
No, I kind of misstated it in the beginning when we were talking about it earlier. What I do is I have a program that just generates the raw figures based on the times and the charts that I have for pace and speed. But what I do first is, once I have those raw figures, I then go calculate a pace variant, but it's not human made. It is made by the computer. It is one where, because I'm looking at the winners, normally the pace variant's not going to be all that much, but on a windy day, it might be, if every winner was running a 10 points faster pace figure than they did final time figure, the pace variant's going to say it was 10 fast. And I'm being very simplistic here. It gets adjusted by distance because, different parts of the track are used for pace calls at different distances. Obviously, the first quarter for a one-turn mile is run on a completely different part of the track as the first quarter for a 6-furlong race. And they both be on a straightaway, so that's not that big of a deal. But sometimes you're getting into the turn, so it can skew things a little bit. But I don't want to get too deep into that stuff here, but I actually do make that computer-generated pace variant first and apply it to the raw figures, and that's what spits out on my worksheet. So when me and my assistant look at the worksheets that are generated, we don't have to worry about the pace variant. It's already built in. All we're trying to do is come up with a final time variant, and then that would be applied to all the figures.
So your pace variant, though, is relative to the final time. So if you're saying, is this what we would expect given this final time? If it's not, then you see if you average the differences to see if there's a difference, right? But it's really comparing it to the raw final time to the raw pace time, to see if anything's out of whack.
Yes,
like that they're running.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep, you have it exactly right. We don't see that. The only thing is, when I generate the worksheets, if there's any kind of weird swings in there where, the first 3 were plus 15 and the last 3 were minus 20, I'll take a look at it and see. And sometimes it's just the way the races are run. It's the way the pace went, but, maybe the wind shifted or something like that, or, it's hard to say. I watch a lot of races when I do this stuff. So, but for the most part, the pace variants are just automated. And now if it rains or, the track condition changes, then we break it off and start another new pace variant. We don't just lump the whole day together automatically. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at there. But for the most part, if it's a fast track all day, it's just going to be one pace variant.
So that makes perfect sense. What about, I know you're always lamenting all the different run-ups. So is it as a different run up, a different track? It's on your configurations. Do you consider it like a different track and you have to calculate a different sample for that different run up?
Yeah, for the most, now that's a bigger issue on turf than it is on dirt, because on dirt, even though the run-ups might not be consistent from distance to distance, they're almost always consistent at the same distance. So like when I do 6.5 furlongs at Aqueduct, the run-up's going to be in a pretty tight range. So I can feel comfortable grouping all of those together. On turf, that's not always the case because they have different gaps that they'll use. They don't want to wear out the same part of the course. So even on the same rail setting, they may use different gaps. So you can't use the same pace chart for different races. It can get very confusing. And luckily, that's all in my data feed and it's all programmed into what I do. So it's one of the, because they'll even do where, especially like Gulfstream, Keeneland did it a few times until I kept complaining, and they actually listened to me, which was nice of them, to like stop running your 2 grade 1 races at the same distance on the same day with different run-ups. I said it makes it very hard to compare, and it's just a bad look, really. It doesn't make any sense. And they listened, and they don't do that anymore. But you know, some tracks will just run, namely Gulfstream, a whole bunch of, they'll run 3 different gaps, and sometimes they have 3 different courses on the same day. And it can be a nightmare making figures for those, but we do the best we can, and we at least avoid comparing races that really shouldn't be compared because the run-up's vastly different, or, you know, the rail's different, or whatever it happens to be in that particular situation.
All right, so you've got all these different configurations you factor in, and you create your final time figure using the variant that we've talked about, and you have your pace figures. So you will actually show the pace figures and the final time figures, and then you also will show on your Timeform USPPs kind of an adjusted final time based on pace. So can you talk a little bit about how those things all fit together?
Yeah, well, the thing when we first started Timeform US, Mark Attenberg, who I mentioned earlier, it's like I think our motto was playing the races, modernized and faster was the big key. And, you know, one of those is a lot of people don't want to spend as much time as a guy like me or you do. I know we're more into this, but you get a lot of casual players and they just want to know, oh, hey, who does these numbers think is the best horse? So we see it all the time. We saw it in the Breeders' Cup Classic this year. I still am seeing arguments over who ran the better race, Fierceness or Sierra Leone, because of pace, right? And I forget what the gap was. I think it was a couple lengths at the finish. And there's a lot of people out there saying that, hey, Fierceness ran the better race. He should even get the Eclipse Award based on that. I don't really have an opinion on that, but we're trying to take that kind of guesswork out of there and put it into a number. And in this particular case, Sierra Leone still nosed out Fierceness by 1 point, I think it was, but it definitely did narrow the gap because of how fast the pace was that day. And that's what we're just trying to do, is simplify things and tell people that the pace does matter. Now, we don't always do it the same way. It depends if it's turf or dirt, and it depends how long the race is, how much the adjustments will be, and in which direction. But for the most part, we're just kind of getting people away from maybe the final time didn't matter as much, and the number that we really highlight is that combined number.
So, and typically on a dirt race, you'll see pace adjustments, the pace, the final adjusted figure just adjusted up because of a faster than normal pace. Where on turf, it's the opposite. Typically when you see those adjustments up, they're going to be more because of a slow early pace and a fast late pace, right?
Right. And that goes back to, you know, when I first started doing this, I had all this in a database, and I still do. And when I looked it up, the turf horses who run slow because of slow paces, if you don't upgrade their figures, it's going to kill you at the windows if you're using the figures as part of your betting. If you don't, you're just going to make a whole bunch of bad bets. On dirt, it's the same in the opposite direction. You can't really upgrade horses because they ran slow early, because it just doesn't work on dirt for the most part. But what you can do is you can upgrade them when the pace is too fast, which is exactly what we did with Fierceness. They ran way faster that day. As I'm talking, I'm kind of pulling up the chart so I can see exactly what it was. But we're just telling you horses who, and it's not as simple as just combining the pace and the speed figure. There's more to it. It goes by where you were in the field, if you were the leader, how much you led by, things like that. But yeah, in this case, like Sierra Leone, he ran a 1:34 final time figure, and that's exactly what his overall figure is, because he's a deep closer, or he was in that race, and the pace really helped him. There's no reason to give him any extra credit. Whereas Fierceness ran a 1:32, we only gave him 1 extra point. Some of that has to do with 1.25 miles, but part of it is the pace wasn't really as fast as a lot of people made it out to be. And I think you saw that in the result, where the 2-3 finishers were right there early. They were right up on the pace. So it wasn't that big of a surprise that they held around. And I think people saw those raw fractions that were posted, and I think it was just barely a sub 44, like a 109 and change. But if you know Del Mar and you had that model like I do of how the track plays even at 10 furlongs, you would realize, yeah, it was a fast pace, but it wasn't like one of those Derby meltdowns where some sprinter went out and went 21 to the quarter.
Well, it was a fast race, but it was the best dirt horses in the world. I mean, you would expect it to be fast. I mean, not insanely fast, right, but yeah, you expect him to go pretty fast, at least the leaders. And I would even say that Newgrange was relatively close to that pace. So, I mean, you could even say second, third, and fourth all pretty held together pretty well. It wasn't anything like it fell apart at all. Yeah, I was.
No, the top four.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the top four after a mile, they finished the top four. I mean, nobody passed each other through the lane. So.
Yeah, and so that's what I'm in the camp where I've never been a Sierra Leone fan, but that race made me a believer, because I don't want to get too much into this, but it just kind of goes to what you're trying to get at. It wasn't like he sat way back and then clunked up late. He made an early move, and it was a move where he was passing horses long before they even got to the stretch. He was passing them before they were all tiring, and he sustained that all the way through the wire. So, I think your numbers, your algorithm matches my intuition at least. I didn't think it was an insanely fast pace. It didn't fall apart, and Sierra Leone didn't lag way back and then just clunk up and everybody's hit the wall. He made a real early move. He was passing horses throughout the entire turn. By the time they spun out of the turn, it looked like he was going to be the winner, right? So, yeah, I agree with everything your figures are saying there. And then
one of the things we give in Timeform US is one of the things we give in Timeform US is a running style. And one of the things I do track is, just based on absolutely nothing else, what kind of ROI do running styles have? And it goes to what you were talking about with Sierra Leone, because we have closer, but we also have plotter. And generally, as you would expect, especially on dirt, the ROI gets worse and worse as you go from leader to speed to tracker and so on. But when you get to closer, I mean, closers are still reasonably okay. When you get to plotter, which are those horses that don't make the early move like Sierra Leone did, the horses who are still lagging near the back as you're halfway on the turn, those horses are just dreadful from a betting perspective. So I just thought that kind of went to your point that, it's okay to be a closer in a fast-paced race, but that doesn't mean you can wait till the top of the stretch to make your move most of the time. You better be moving well before that.
Yeah, and the one thing that you haven't mentioned, I'll bring up because some figure makers do factor this in, is ground loss. And a reason I bring it up that made me think about it was Sierra Leone was parked pretty wide on both turns, and if you factor in ground loss, I think his performance is even more impressive. I know you don't build that into your time form U.S. figures. I know you've talked about possibly doing that. What are your feelings about ground loss and how that might affect your figures, and if what you at least have thought about doing in terms of making that adjustment?
Yeah, I think ground loss is a fascinating avenue to take when you make figures. It is one I definitely do include it in my handicapping, no doubt about that. And I would include it in my figures if it ever becomes part of the official data that we get when you go to make figures. We don't have that. I know the Ragazins and the Sheets use ground loss, but they have people who I guess are tracking it themselves. I guess there's some promise that maybe the current systems will eventually have it. I know there's ground loss in the GPS charts, which I looked at for the Kentucky Derby because I don't know if you remember, I actually made figures that included ground loss, and they were pretty good. The ground loss looked good to me. It matched what I saw on the screen. So maybe there's some hope, but that is still not really available in the main feed. And it's also only for some tracks, not for a lot of tracks. So I wouldn't want to be making figures where half the tracks were tracks that had ground loss calculated in and some others didn't. I think it would be comparing apples to oranges and not something I really want to do. But at some point, I don't know if it'll happen in our lifetime, but I imagine it'll be part of the data in horse racing. And I think it's really valuable information. I don't think it's as simple as this horse was too wide on both turns, so you got to elevate him a couple lengths. I don't think that's how it works. I think pace and ground loss kind of go together. If you're, I always use the analogy, if me and you go walk around a standard, like Olympic sized running track, and I walk on the outside and you walk on the inside, I'll be able to keep up with you as long as we're walking with no problem. Even though I might expend a little bit of energy, extra energy, it won't be enough to matter if the second lap we decide to run. We'll have the same amount. But if we were sprinting as fast as we can, and we're of equal ability, and you're on the inside and I'm out in the 8 path, I'm toast. There's no way I can possibly keep up if I have to stay out there. So I just think the pace really matters. I don't think the guys I talked about before can quite capture all of that the way that they make figures. And it's something, it could turn out to be totally wrong. Maybe horses would be different, but I don't think so, really. I've seen enough at play where in a turf race, if the pace is slow in the first turn, it doesn't matter if you're 5 wide before you get position on the back stretch. And similarly, if the pace was really fast on the first turn and you go wide on the second turn when the pace is completely falling apart and everybody's going slow again, it doesn't really matter that much. It might even be a benefit. So I think ground loss is fascinating and something that I do hope to do someday. I just need the data, and it would definitely be a little bit different than how people do it currently.
Yeah, and the other thing you've mentioned in a different context was kickback, and that's why, you can save ground on dirt. Sometimes you pay the price, right, in terms of the kickback, yeah. Where on turf, you don't typically have that as an issue, and like you said, you can tuck in and draft behind horses and not have to eat kickback. So I do think ground loss is probably more significant in general on turf than it is on dirt, just because you don't have that same trade-off that you have on dirt. But I would definitely think that it could improve figures if you can get good, accurate information on ground loss, at least on turf racing. In particular, you mentioned how it's pace related. Well, turf sprints, I think, are where it's the biggest factor. Going wide on a turf sprint is just a kiss of death. And it's just because what you said.
Oh, yeah.
They're flying. That's the fastest horses on earth are turf sprinters, because you said the surface is the fastest. And, they go around one turn, they're full speed on that turn. And if you're parked 4 wide, you're expending a tremendous amount of energy, more energy than someone, on the inside. So to me, that would probably be the place where you get the biggest bang for your buck if you can get accurate information. Typically it's going to be meaningful on those turf sprints. At least that's the way I've always handicapped. And I've always had a lot of success on turf sprints. A lot of people don't.
Yeah, I have no argument with that at all.
Yeah. Which you did bring up, better measurements. So, it's been a lot controversial in terms of accuracy, but I mean, in theory, this GPS where you get the actual distance and velocity of a horse throughout its entire trip, if that data was accurate and available, it seems like that could totally transform the way you build your figures, right? Because you'd have this exact, you would know exactly how fast, or a lot more precisely how fast the horse went throughout the entire race, and what distance it was traveling, or what speed it was traveling, and what distance it traveled. Have you ever thought about that and the implications for making figures? Or I'm just curious, because it seems like that could really be a game changer in that field.
Oh yeah, I have definitely thought about it. I think we're a ways away from being able to count it as being reliable enough. Like I said, I was encouraged by the ground loss. I do think GPS is getting better for sure. They're getting better and better trackers, and they're using more than one tracker per horse. So it's better, but it still has a ways to go, in my opinion, before you can get too precise where they're measuring ground loss. I think it's every half furlong, if I remember right. At worst, every furlong. It might be every furlong. I get mixed up with trackers sometimes still, but when it first came out, I can remember there was an apple blossom, and GPS was just starting to put the charts out with the ground loss, and it wasn't even me this time. There were people immediately going, "What is this? It's ridiculous." They had a horse who was on the rail the whole time, traveling further than the horse was 3 wide the whole time, and they pulled it for a while. But I noticed it came back, and I started checking, and it actually looked pretty decent. But until the time that we have it everywhere, and by everywhere, I'm not talking about Podunk Downs. If they don't have it, that's fine. But when all the major circuits have it, then that's something, that I think would be worth exploring, how reliable the data is and if it adds some value. And that's a good thing nowadays, is it's really easy to put all the data you can possibly gather into a database, and before you make any changes and decide, do I want to put ground loss and what kind of formula do I use? It doesn't really have to be guesswork anymore. You can test it out yourself and see what works the best. And you have to be a little careful because, I'm sure you've heard of backfitting. It doesn't always work when you go forward, but I think with things that are theoretical about how to measure horses as opposed to betting, I think that's a lot better avenue to go down. So what I'm saying is, if being too wide on the first turn when the pace is fast, you can come up with the best optimal value to add to a horse's figure to make it look better than what the original number did. What I wouldn't want to do is use that data to say, oh, that found me this 25-to-1 shot that paid $52. And, that kind of stuff doesn't really work in horse racing. I've been down many of those paths before. You can use that as a starting point, but that's a whole different discussion. As far as making figures, I think databases are really reliable for that kind of thing.
Well, speaking of backfitting, Keith Bush had a question on Twitter that he wanted me to ask you. And that, first of all, I know the answer to this, but I'll ask it. Do you ever go back and change a number after the fact? If so, what would cause you to do that? And is there any danger in doing that in terms of like overfitting, going the data? So maybe you can answer that question.
For me, Yeah, for me, I do not change many figures after the fact. If I do, it is because it was an obvious mistake. It's not one of those where, I was on the fence one way or the other. It's just one where, it could be as simple as I entered a variant wrong, which that's happened maybe 3 times in a year, and you usually catch it within a couple days before it ever hurts anybody. But every now and then there'll just be a race that just looks way too fast or way too slow, and horses start running back. And I'll get emails. David Aragona would write to me and say, hey, you should check this race or check that race. And I would check, and I hear from other people. If a guy like David, I'm going to take it more seriously. My inclination is not to change them unless the evidence is absolutely overwhelming that I blew a figure. And it's not so much like I'm not trying to be vain and say, oh, I had it right. Even if I had it wrong, if it's not that much enough to matter, what I don't want to do is say, some guy who bet $50 on this figure that was a 90 the first time a horse ran, and he comes back this time and now it's a 75, and he's like, wait a minute, I just bet $50 on that horse because you gave him a 90 and now you turned around and changed it. And what I've discovered, my old boss, Mark Attenberg, he used to write about a lot of figures and say, hey, we've had 2 runbacks. It's not looking too good. And I'd say, just wait, hold off a little while. And we go back 2 months later and the figure would be fine. You can't make rash decisions just based on 1 or 2 or even 3 runbacks. Give the horses some time, particularly when they don't run back that often anymore. You don't want to overreact because a horse ran back in 2 weeks and another in 3 weeks. They may have very well come back too quick and didn't run their race. So I would say the vast majority of time, I'm not changing figures, and the small amount that I am, it's not going to have any long-term effect.
So you're reluctant to do that unless you kind of find an obvious, what you think looks like an obvious error. Your judgment calls, you're willing to kind of just ride those out, typically, the close calls.
Yes. And that kind of makes it better for when we go back and try to review, how can we do? I know my assistant, he likes at the end of the year, he goes, I'm not going to say he goes through every single sheet, but we'll look at the ones that we gave letter codes to and, see, what did we do wrong or what did we do right? And just kind of live with it. That's just the way it goes. Normally by the time, if there is a race that is, maybe I should have changed it, it's not going to matter anyway, because the horses have already run back 2 or 3 times and people aren't going to pay that much attention to that one or realize that it's an outlier. And again, if a figure's 20 points wrong and all the horses are just running ridiculously slower or faster than that race, I will change it, but it just doesn't happen very often.
So one other factor that I know it's controversial to some folks, but I know you do include the option for users to build that into the number, and that is how weight affects the final time figures. So talk a little bit about that, and what your adjustment is for weight, and just why you include that in. Because there are people, and I've gotten into a few Twitter discussions where, it's almost a religion that they don't think weight matters on a horse. What's a 5 pounds on a 1,200 pound horse? So maybe talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, I guess I get that, but physics would tell you otherwise, that it has to have some effect. It's just a matter of how much. The Timeform US adjustments are pretty small. We definitely use conservative ones. For every pound change, we just do half a point. So it takes 2 pounds to make a point difference. If a horse is picking up 10 pounds, I don't see how anybody couldn't think that would matter. And this isn't just me. We've tested it in the database. I've been asked this question many times. Weight on or weight off, which setting do you use? And I always say weight on, and they ask why, and I say because it improves the win percentage and the ROI slightly. But I'd rather improve it slightly than not at all. So I don't think it's a huge deal one way or the other. But why not use it if you know that it's going to give you even slightly better results when you're talking a game with a 20% takeout? Maybe it'll give you 1%, and that could push you into profitable territory. Who knows? But I use it. I get why people say it would. Some people say it doesn't matter, but I also remember the time of racing when horses actually did carry weight, and I know it mattered. There was no doubt that it mattered. That's why trainers complained for a long time when their horses were assigned too much weight, and why we've gotten in the situation now where we don't have any real handicap races. If weight didn't matter, we'd still have handicap races.
Yeah, it's you raised several good points. One, the physics, force equals mass times acceleration. So if the mass goes up, it does require more energy to push for the horse to go around the track. So that's kind of irrefutable. Like you said, though, it's a matter of degree. But the entire sport of racing has been built around the fact that weight matters. Like you said, it used to be handicaps, but there's weight allowances for sex and age, and and in some of the jurisdictions like Hong Kong, they build the whole class system around the weights, and they have all kinds of data, good data, that shows that these weight adjustments are meaningful. And the other thing people have to remember is, you can say, well, maybe it's only like 0.5% affects maybe 0.5% of their performance. Well, in a 1 mile race, 0.5% of the race isn't a whole lot. That's most races are just decided by a length or two, right, or less. That 0.5% is the difference between winning or losing. And so it always amuses me when people just absolutely, like I said, just will not accept the fact that weight matters. But all the data and the entire history of the sport would is countered, and physics, the laws of physics all support it. So, it's just one of those things you just kind of give up. It's kind of like arguing about religion. But I'm glad you factor that into your figures, or at least allow people to, include that adjustment. They can all, if they don't trust it or like it, you always give them that option not to include it, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I mentioned we also limit at the lower end. Like, I think if horses drop below 113 pounds, that didn't really seem to have an effect. I have my opinion as to why that is. I think it's because the vast majority of times that you're talking about horses, well, they can't make it, or it's an apprentice who's not very good. So it generally gives away the advantage. But I know you and I remember when apprentices were a much huger deal than they are now, even on the big circuits. I mean, you would get apprentices that would come in and win riding titles. I can remember Edgar Prado and Kent DeSormo just completely dominating, because not only were they good riders, they obviously are both Hall of Famers, but they're also were getting a huge weight break, and they were young and strong, and they made that count. And trainers sought them out because they were good riders who were also getting an advantage. We don't see that so much anymore, and I just think it's because the weights they don't matter here like they do other places, because for whatever reason, I don't know why, they just rate races differently, where they rate them so weight doesn't matter a whole bunch. And sometimes they do it the wrong way, where we used to give horses weight breaks because they hadn't raced in a long time, and they'd be coming off a layoff. Now that's the norm. I have no idea why we're giving them weight breaks anymore. We should be giving them weight breaks to the horses that come back quick to encourage them to run, maybe.
Yeah, the racing secretaries have basically taken weight completely out of the game. So I don't want to get down the rabbit trail or rabbit hole, whatever, but to me, if they would just use weight the way they used to, and the way they do, like in Hong Kong, and give the meaningful weight adjustments for age and sex, then they could have a lot fewer conditions. I mean, you could have, there's no reason why fillies shouldn't be running against colts all the time. They do fine when they do run against them. Look at in Europe, they're beating the colts all day. Breeders' Cup, fillies win Breeders' Cup races all the time, on the turf. And 3-year-olds can be run against older horses. When they get that weight break, there's no reason why they can't do it. So, I just wish that they would write fewer conditions and just write the weight based on age and sex and maybe a few other things. But, you could have a lot fewer conditions, a lot more, larger fields, more competitive racing. But I don't think that's going to happen in the U.S. anytime soon. But
at some point it needs to.
Yeah, they might.
Yeah, at some point it needs to, because we're quickly approaching 40% favorites winning, and I think a large part of that is because we have way too many conditions, and trainers are able to cherry pick the spot where they're going to be 4 to 5, and it's not good, and things are going to have to change. But that's not really a speed figure issue, but you definitely could equate classes and get bigger fields than what we're getting now. It's getting to where the products just, the majority of races are not very good betting races.
But I do think, if you leverage weight, you could do things. I mean, I really do think there's you can add, there's lots of good data now about where you could make really good weight adjustments. As a way to level the playing field, rather than trying to come up with some artificial conditions that separate, them out by sex and age and recency and all that stuff. But anyway, we can move on. I try not to get on soapboxes on these because people don't want to hear me talk. They want to hear you talk. So let's get back to the topic at hand. So, let's talk a little bit now about for different kinds of, what are the kinds of races where where it's hardest to make figures, where they're probably less reliable, and the type of races, where on the other hand, where they're really reliable and easy to make. So like, what are sort of the extremes? What would be like worst case kind of race to do figures for? What's kind of a best case?
Oh, well, I mean, the extremes, 2-year-old maiden claimers and grade 1 stakes horses. It's pretty simple, really. I mean, the younger and the cheaper horses are, the harder it is to make figures, and the older and the better horses are, the more consistent they are, the easier it is to make speed figures. And as you move up the class ladder, it gets easier because the horses get better and more consistent. And as you move down the class, as you move down, the opposite happens. Doesn't really matter on surface. It's more about age and class. And luckily, there's usually multiple races, and the ones that are hard, you can just kind of ignore them and use the variant from other races. But that doesn't always happen. I know you have some stuff about that in your question list, but for the most part, you kind of use the most consistent horses and the best horses to make the figures, in my opinion, if you want to make the best figures.
So if you have a field full of first-time starters, what you hope is that there's other races at that distance, you use that variant and just apply that to the times, since you can't do any kind of projection of the horses in that race. Is that sort of what you're hoping for in a race like that? Yes,
that's right. That is exactly, and especially if it's in the middle, not the first race or the last race, because you never know, tracks do change. So you'd rather it be between two reliable races, but it doesn't always happen. And sometimes you just have to do the best you can and hope that the track didn't change. And we actually have the option at Timeform US. One of our codes is an I for impossible. And we try not to use it very often, but there are times where, they may just run one turf sprint at Gulfstream Park and it's for 2-year-olds and none of them have ever run before. And we have absolutely nothing to go on. So we won't give it a figure. And maybe after they run 2 or 3 times, we might try if it's particularly if it has some horses that with some relevance to going forward. But if not, we're just going to leave it blank and tell you we just don't know. And we'd rather not make a figure than give you something that could lead you down a bad path. So we'll use that pretty sparingly. But I've only ever really used that for 2-year-old maidens. That's about the only time. That's maybe early season 3-year-old maidens, but usually you'll have at least a couple in the field that have run before. So for the most part, and I've seen it happen too, where they'll run one turf race, like I talked about, for maiden 2-year-olds, and then the rains come and they get raced off the turf, or even if they run, it's a completely different track. And, if you just have nothing to go on, you can't make a figure. At least we have that option. I think I remember seeing that Bayer is contractually obligated to make a figure for every race, but at least with us, we don't have to. And if we do, we can give you the code. We have the code F to tell you this race was mostly first-time starters, and we're not super confident because of the data around it. Wasn't enough to be confident. So yeah, there are ways to go with that, but they're definitely not easy.
Yeah, that I can see where you have some time you just got to throw up your hands and you have no data to go on, and then it's just kind of a guess. So given that, like, say, not the extremes, but your typical figure, if you were going to put an error bound around it, like you give a horse an 80, would you say then typical error bound, what is it, like plus or minus how many points would you say you're with, like 90% confidence, or 95% if we want to use kind of the scientific rule of thumb? What error bound would you put around where you're 95% confident that it's in that range? We got it within that range.
Yeah, the way I would answer that is when I handicap it, if horse A pretty much consistently runs 90, or the race I'm really interested in, he ran a 90, and horse B ran an 88, that's basically the same horse to me. There's not a whole lot of difference there. We're talking, if it's a sprint, we're talking a length. So, it's just not that much. If people think figures are that precise, if they're betting a 90 over an 89 because of the number, they should probably rethink that. I think 3 would probably be enough to make me take notice. If I had to draw a line, it would be at 2 points.
So if it's more than 3 points, more than 2 points, you kind of see that as a significant difference between less than 2 points. You're probably not thinking of that as a separator.
Yeah, I wouldn't use the word significant, but I would say a meaningful at least. So something meaningful. Is a difference. Right. Yeah. I'm probably thinking too much math when I say significant. They basically mean the same thing, but 3, I start to notice that's some separation.
All right, so I'm going to ask you a couple other kind of a little bit off the wall questions. So, like, how long have you been doing figures now? For how many years? Since when did you start?
I would say I started when I first got to McGuire, which was 1985. So
in that time you've been making them, what is the highest figure you've given out on your current scale, and who did you give it to?
I would say it was, I'm not going to swear I can remember everybody from the 80s, but I would say it was probably Flightline. I think he got a 151 when he won the Pacific Classic. And that's pretty much, he blew everybody away, if memory serves. I think the highest I had done before that was the low 140s, which Gun Runner did maybe 3 or 4 times. Some others ran it now and then, like Arrogate, I think, ran a 140 somewhere in there. Been a few others along the way, but Flightline was just on another level.
Yeah, and, visually that race was pretty awesome. That would be the kind of race you'd expect to see a big number on. He just kept going and going and going. He was like the Energizer Bunny in that race. So that was one where you think that's going to come back fast, right? You maybe not, you didn't know it's going to be 150, but you knew it was going to come back fast, right?
Yeah, that's the 150. Right. That kind of surprised me.
Yeah, that's really fast. So here's one you can either answer or not, but I'm going to ask it. So you got guys. Now we can talk about guys like Service and Navarro. We could say they were cheating because it's been proven in court of law that they were cheating. So I'm not going to go beyond those guys, although I wouldn't limit cheating trainers to those two. But I think we can talk about them in the public space as being guilty of, drugging their horses to take an advantage. Could you spot those guys when you're making figures? Did they jump out like a sore thumb? Service and Navarro, and do you continue to be able to spot potential nefarious activities from trainers through the figures that you're making? Just curious. If you don't have to answer that if you don't want to, or any part of that, but I'm just curious.
No, I'm happy to answer. I definitely spotted those two guys, and I'm sure I tweeted about them many times, even before they were caught. I don't know if anybody would be bored enough to dig through my Twitter feed, but I know I talked about them for sure. I never came out and said they were cheating because, I didn't know. I suspected, just like I suspect some guys are cheating now. I won't name names because, what's the point? Everybody can see it. To me, I don't know, I see speculation thrown around way too loosely, particularly with the top guys. And I don't know if I'm really willing to go down that path because these are the guys that are getting the best of the best horses. And I would expect them to have the best horses. What made it so easy with Service and Navarro was they were heavily involved in the claiming game. And you could see them take horses from trainers you knew who were good. I'm not talking about 5% trainers, or trainers that had two horses over 10 years or something like that, who were good, respected horsemen that won. And you would just see these huge jumps and they would sustain it for 3 or 4 or 5 races sometimes. And then they would go away and you'd never hear from these horses again. And it was just really obvious. And I think mostly it was because of the claiming game and changing hands. I wouldn't want to label somebody a cheater just because their horse looks like he re-breaks in the stretch when he may very well be the best horse anyway. I'm not saying they're not. I have no idea. I'm sure there are people cheating. I'm sure there's people cheating at all levels of the game. I just don't know who they are. But when you're talking about guys that are getting new horses in the barn all the time and gals too, because I've seen gals that I'm highly suspicious of, when they make the big jump repeatedly with these claiming horses that have an established base, then, I would testify in court that I thought they were cheating. But it's because of the claiming races. That, to me, is what makes it easy.
So if the horse has been in the trainer's barn for its entire career, you don't see that, dramatic change in performance that you would when you see him change hands. That's why it'd be a lot harder to detect that in a barn where they don't get, we're not playing the claiming game or getting lots of older horses, coming into their barn from other barns.
Yeah, how would I know? To me, maybe they are, maybe they aren't. I really don't know. I like to think that for the most part, the game is on the up and up, because if it wasn't, why would I play, right? Nobody wants to be the sucker at the table. I think the vast majority of races are on the level, and there's probably a little too much whining about cheaters. But that said, I don't deny that we all know there's some people cheating and taking an edge out there. I would like to think that at the top levels of the game that there's care being taken to catch these guys and know who they are if that's happening, but who knows if it is or not. But I personally don't really play claiming races anymore. That's one of the reasons, along with the multitude of conditions. I just don't think they're worth it for me and my skill set when I bet races, but I don't really see this stuff when I look at the better racing, when I focus on allowance. And yeah, the same guys win a lot of races, but they also have the best horses. And I don't see, if a top trainer was going to be a cheater, wouldn't you see big jumps in the biggest races and, That's how I see it. And I just don't really see that.
Well, that's a good lead into my next question was going to be, okay, so you're not into the claiming races. So talk about how you use your speed and pace figures to evaluate races and play races, and maybe talk about some of your favorite angles or the kind of horses or races you're looking at to bet. So let's kind of get into the betting side or the handicapping side. Now kind of move on from making the figures to actually using them. So maybe talk a little bit about that.
So I'm a pattern guy. I look for, I mentioned earlier in the podcast that I like horses that winners tend to often get underestimated, and that on average they improve their figure. I think I mentioned 8 points. Whatever the number was, it's a substantial number. And you know, the game has changed from the 80s. I used to be able to go to Garden State Park and bet the simulcast, and as rudimentary as my figures were, I could just bet top figure horses and do pretty well most nights and come out with a profit. Those days, in my opinion, are pretty much gone. Everybody has decent speed figures now. You're betting against CAWs who certainly have very good speed figures. They're betting the most money. So I've kind of changed my approach to, I'm trying to figure out the horses who are going to jump up and the ones who are going to be underrated by the public. And that could be for a lot of reasons. Some of it is just, you can see in figures horses are getting better. And this is particularly true with younger horses. 2 and 3 year olds, I think they are a good place to start as a figure guy, looking for horses who, you know, people bet them like they're older horses. They just want to bet the higher figures. And that's not how it works with younger horses. They are constantly changing. Some are getting better. Some have already reached their peak. And I like to try to figure that out. And some of it, I have some patterns, like I love horses third off the layoff, but only under specific circumstances. And that's where they ran better the second time than the first time off the layoff, but neither time have they reached their top from the past. And that's one where I've been using it. I probably shouldn't say this, but I've been using it for a long time and it still works. Now, you know, there's cases where if it's a claiming horse, which I don't really play anymore, but when I did, if there was a change in barn, I wouldn't do it or something like that. But it works pretty good for horses coming off a layoff still. You're not going to get a great winning percentage, and you don't want to do it when the horse is 6-5. But if you get a good price on horses like that, I think it's worth taking a shot. And the other time is just bad trips where horses come in with figures that you know would be better if you accounted for some things like ground loss and trouble. And I'm talking about subtle trouble, not the kind of trouble where everybody sees it. And, you know, had the horse not had trouble, he would have snuck up the rail and won with a perfect trip. I mean, who wants that kind of trouble? That horse is always going to get bet too hard, but I'm talking about the kind of trouble where, you know, a horse was 3 wide trying to get up to the leader on the first turn. Maybe he gets there eventually, but he's got nothing left for the stretch and he'll get beat pretty bad. Track biases, you know, I try to look for track biases, and I'm not a big guy for betting when I think the card is biased, because for whatever reason, even though I can identify a bias, usually I'm not very good at identifying which horse is going to take advantage of it. And because a lot of that has to do with the jockey and, you know, the horse, if he's fast enough or if he can take advantage of it, if it's a rail bias or if the jockey recognizes it, if it's a dead rail I'm just not good at it. But what I like to do is when I know where there was a bias, look for the horses who were hampered by it. And particularly when they just run bad. I mean, people all look for, this horse was second against the bias. Those horses always get bet. It's the horses that get beat by a lot and run a really subpar figure, and you know they have better in them. And that's particularly true like in maiden races where horses have only run once or twice. This is something I learned from my former podcast partner, David Aragona, watching his horses to watch. He would pick out some horses. I would say, man, that's crazy. What does he see in this horse? And then I'd watch the video and the light would go on. Yeah, people are going to look and see this horse ran a 25 buyer. And yeah, maybe he's not a great horse, but that trip might have cost him. Maybe he could have run a 60, and a 60 is good enough to win this race. So, I look for things like that where the figures aren't necessarily representing how good I think a horse is. Don't get me wrong, there are rare cases where just the top figure horse is getting overlooked for whatever reason. If I can figure out what that reason is, I will happily bet them. If I don't know what it is, it usually turns out that there was a reason and I don't know what it was. So I do avoid those, but generally that's how I do it. I'm always looking for value. I'm almost never going to bet a favorite. I won't say never, because there have been times where I'll see a horse that's 2-1 and I think it should be 4-5, and I'll take it if they win. But for the most part, I'm looking for those improving horses that I think are better than the numbers they've run in the last race or two.
So you mentioned bias. You do flag biased in races that were, either speed biased or closer bias on Timeform US. You want to talk a little bit about how you make those determinations and how you use that information as a bettor, but also how you develop that, bias flags in Timeform?
Yeah, those are computer generated, and they're just looking at how well speed did or how well closers did. It's one of those I would prefer if we had where they were on the track, so we could do inside and outside. But as we talked about with ground loss, that is not really available yet. So for now, they just indicate, we look at all the races that are being run on a card on dirt. We only do these for dirt for now, because usually there's just not enough turf races. Del Mar might be the lone exception. Maybe Santa Anita. Because the other tracks all have multiple turf races that run a ton, turf courses that run a ton of races, so it would be tough. But we stick to dirt, and we're projecting based on the distance of the races. Like a 6 furlong race, the leader might be likely to win 50% of the time, whereas a 9 furlong race, it might be 25% of the time. So we take the distance into account, and then we just look, how well did the first place horse at the first call do? How well did the second place horse do? We compare it to what was expected, and if that gap is bigger than what we expected, we throw up the color code. There are some caveats to it where, like, if a horse is odds on favorite, we don't even count that race if he wins the race, because, too many people, I know we've seen at Saratoga, the first 2 races on dirt will be one wire to wire, and it was a 6-5 and a 4-5, and everybody's screaming it's a speed bias, and you just can't really make those kind of calls, in my opinion. So we toss those horses, and we just look at the rest of the races, and if it's overwhelmingly speed's doing poor or speed's doing bad, we'll throw that color code in there. And I'm more of an in-depth handicapper than that. I'll see the codes, and that'll make me look deeper. But I don't often just base anything on that flag that we throw up there, the blue or the red, and we have different shades for how strong it is. But normally when, like, the bright red or the bright blue comes up, there was usually something going on, and you'll look and see there was a speed bias or there was a bad rail that caused, I would say most times a closer bias is caused by a bad rail. Well, not always, but for the most part, that's how I use them. It's just kind of a starting point when I assess track bias.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I kind of do the same thing. I pay more attention to the dark red and dark blue flags, and then I usually go look at the races that day and see what was driving it. And first thing I look at is, does it look like there was an inside or outside bias? Typically the speed bias kind of maps to inside a favorable rail and closer bias to a bad rail, but not always. But in general, that's kind of what I've found anyway. Because a lot of times you'll have horses that benefit from that bias that, didn't. They might have had a pocket trip or sat mid-pack on the rail, and that actually, it might show up as a red speed favoring bias that was really more of a rail bias, and they actually were helped by it, even though they were closed at the end. It was because they, had that rail trip. So you got to be careful with those.
Mm.
All right. So what about the way you bet? So you talked about some handicapping. What about, what kind are you a win better, exacta, tries, horizontal pick plays? I mean, are there favorite types of bets you like to make? Or are you pretty flexible? How do you kind of determine what pools you're going to bet into?
Yeah, I would say I am mostly a win and exacta guy. Not a big horizontal guy. The way I play, it's hard for, I'm so anti-favorite most of the time that I usually get burned throwing out a favorite that I shouldn't have. Although I did play when we were doing the podcast at DRF with David, we were doing pick fives and occasionally pick four, depending on the sequence. And I actually hit some really nice ones. And I always made sure I played, if I'm going to go on a podcast and say I'm playing, then I would play. But even though I did do well on those, I mean, ROI, I lost many, many, many more than I hit. They're just not for me. I don't know how I can explain it. I guess it's the way I grew up. I'm kind of a race by race guy. I like playing win bets. If the price is right, I would say exactas are probably my favorite bet. And I will occasionally play trifectas under the right circumstances, which mostly means the really big days when I know the pools are going to be big. But I would say outside of what I did for the podcast, probably 95% of my action is wins and exactas, and probably 60% is exacta.
So when betting, we don't have to spend too much time on that. What about exactas? What would get you interested in an exacta? Say you find a horse you want to bet to win, but what gets you, to go beyond the win pool into the exacta pool?
It'd just be two horses that I like that I think are better value than what they're being bet. Now, we know that doesn't always transfer, especially at NYRA these days. So you got to be a little bit careful of what pools you're betting in because of the way the CAWs are betting. But that only really applies to NYRA. Usually there's some correlation. Excuse me. One skill I think you really do have to have these days is to be able to guess what the odds are going to be. That took some time to figure out, and it's something I'm still working on. There are some tools out there that help a little bit. DRF does the projected odds, which I was part of. They could probably use an update, to be honest. But they're decent. They at least tell you if you're getting 6-1 right now and those projected odds show 3-1, I can guarantee you're not getting 6-1. You may not go all the way down to 3-1, but you're not going to get 6. But I think you really need to look at the pools and don't just look at the tote board because sadly it just doesn't mean a whole lot anymore.
Yeah. So what you talked about would that just mean there's 3 horses you like, or is that, what would get you into the try pool? You said occasionally you do that. What's an example of when you go into the try?
Well, when I would go into the try, it's going to be the big days because there's generally big fields, and I'm talking Triple Crown days, Breeders' Cup days, maybe Travers Day, and a race where I just don't like the favorite at all. Like I'm not going to use that horse in the trifecta. So I would spread a little bit more and just kind of, hope to get a little bit lucky, but it's usually going to be just an extension of my exacta bet. Like I'm never going to hit the try and not hit the exacta. It's just kind of an added on, if I spend $50 in exactas, maybe I'll throw 10 more in tries, knowing that if I'm right, I'm going to win almost as much on those tries as I would on the exacta. If I'm wrong, it's not that big of a deal. It's not like I'm not betting big tickets on tries, but I'm swinging for the fences. So when I do hit, it hits big.
Well, you did. You said you're not big on the bigger picks, but what about like a double? If you like horses in consecutive races, do you play the double? And if you're going to play them to win in both races, do you play the double? I'm just curious if you ever go that direction.
My friend that I mentioned way back on the podcast, Ken Beck, who was my high school buddy with Larry, that we always went to the track together. He's always playing doubles. And for some reason, it's a blind spot for me. And I keep telling him I'm going to work on it because I really should. I think pick threes have lost all value now. And I think pick fours and fives are pretty tough. You got to be able to withstand long losing streaks. Doubles, there's no reason for me not to play them other than I just never have, and it's a bad habit. So that's something I'm going to try to work on. I've been telling him the same exact thing recently when he tells me he's a big Charlestown guy. He's always playing doubles. So just for whatever reason, it's that blind spot that I need to get better.
No, because I everything you said makes sense. I mean, it's tough. Pick fives, pick fours, they're tough bets to craft, and to do it efficiently, you've got to, be able to accept losing a lot. And you're right, even the more exotic vertical bets, it's to me, it's a different thing trying to figure out who's going to run third or fourth than it is to who's going to win, because there's so much, in terms of, at least usually if you're betting to win, the rider and the trainer, they all have the same goal as you. They'd love to win. But, when a horse is getting tired late in a race, I don't know if the trainer wants the rider to be, pushing the horse too hard if it's already dead tired, to, nose somebody out for fourth place. So, I mean, to me, I kind of get that focusing on win betting. But, doubles, you're kind of still, you've got that same alignment between, the rider and trainer intent and yours in terms of the win pool. And, connect, if you like two horses and you're going to bet them both to win, it seems like there'd be value in that double, right? So it does seem like that's something worth exploring if you're a win better. To me, it seems like the doubles are kind of a logical extension of that. It doesn't mean you have to play the double every time you bet a horse to win, but if you like two races and they're consecutive, it seems like a good way to leverage your opinion if you have a good opinion on both races.
Yeah, well, the next time that you and Scott have me on for your podcast, I'm going to make sure that I'm playing doubles by then. Like you said, not all the time, but there are situations where I like horses in back-to-back races, and I probably should take advantage.
Yeah, it seems like if you're a win better and you're going to bet to win on two consecutive races, I think you always ought to take a look at the double pool, because from a takeout perspective, it's good. On most tracks, the takeout's a little higher for doubles than win. But if you think about it, if you were to parlay it, you'd have a higher takeout. So there's that, you get a takeout advantage. Plus, you can kind of leverage, value on top of value. It is kind of multiplicative. So anyway, Good thing. That's a good. I'm a big fan of playing doubles. Also like to play it in contests. It's a way to leverage your opinion. In the short term, in contests, you have to win a contest, you got to really multiply your bankroll. And it's hard to do that just betting to win. Unless you are gonna, roll you can parlay it, but if you parlay it, then you have two things are a problem. One is the higher takeout, and the other is, if it's not on a big day, you might be impacting your odds. If you're betting a huge amount, even in the win pool. So anyway, I'm a big fan of the doubles, so I encourage you to look at that, and the listeners. If you like to play to win, then to me, if you find a horse you like in one race, then look at those adjacent races and see if you have an opinion in either one of those, and that's a good way to leverage it. All right. Well, I've got a couple final questions, but before we hit those, anything else that we haven't covered about making or using speed or pace figures that you want to bring up?
The only thing I would say is people ask me if figure making has gotten tougher or easier over the years. And as a guy that bets, I would say I think it's probably fair to say to be a little more skeptical about speed figures. And I say that because I think they are, for a lot of reasons, they are tougher to make for sure. Just a couple reasons I would give is, for one, horses just don't race as much anymore. I mean, it seems like almost half of what they used to race. I'm not basing that on stats, just the way it seems. Maybe it's 70% or 60%, I don't know, but they definitely don't race as much. Two, and you kind of mentioned it earlier, is the proliferation of turf races. There are just so many tracks running lots of turf races. So you might get cards like at Saratoga where they run 3 dirt races and 2 of them are for 2-year-olds. And then they run 3 races on the inner turf and 3 races on the outer, and maybe one of them's a sprint, one of them's for 2-year-olds. And there's just not always big samples for these races that we're making figures for. In a perfect world, you could just lump all the 1-turn and 2-turn races together, but that very rarely plays out in practice. As you said, now we have places, New York and Gulfstream already has. They'll be running dirt and synthetic on the same cards. Gulfstream even runs dirt, synthetic, multiple turf courses. So, you know, I wouldn't hitch my wagon when I'm playing to speed figures. I do think they're still an important part of the game when you're assessing horses. You know, nobody wants to bet on slow horses. The one thing I think speed figures can do is keep you from making a lot of bad bets. But while I think they're essential, I also think as a person betting horses that you need to look at a lot of different things in addition to the speed figures. So I'm the guy that makes them, and speed figures are a starting point for me, but they're the starting point on a long journey before I actually hit the send when I'm playing at ExpressBet or Twin Spires or wherever it happens to be, whatever site I'm using that day. I do think they're important. I still make them. I would make them even if I wasn't getting paid to make them because I love it and I would use them when I play, but they're they're much tougher to make than they used to be.
Yeah, you're not the first person to say that. You also didn't mention, I think, another factor is just field sizes are smaller, so you have less data, right?
Yeah, field sizes are smaller, and that even leads to a different thing where the pace is less contested. So oftentimes you don't always get true tests. You get a lot more of these aberrant paces, especially on turf. I mean, if you get a 5-horse turf field or a 10-horse turf field, you're a lot more likely to get at least a normal pace in the 10-horse field as you are the 5. And you know, if you only have 2 races to go on, you want the paces to be as normal as possible. Now, I mean, we've done a lot of work to get around that, and I think we make really good pace figures, but it doesn't mean it's easy to do. And if you're trying to do it on your own, it's quite daunting when you start out. You're going to run into a lot of walls and a lot of pitfalls that you just don't expect. And it's just something that comes from me. You asked me how long I've been doing this. I guess it's 40 years now, almost 40 years. And I'm still learning. I think I'm still getting better at making speed figures. I see things that I can do better, and hopefully I keep building them in. And it's never going to be the key to success. You're not going to be able to just bet speed figures and win because you're betting the horses with the highest numbers. But I do think the better numbers that you have, the better chance you give yourself.
What you reminded me of one other question. Several of the people on Twitter wanted me to ask you, do you make figures for Hong Kong? Have you ever thought, if not, have you ever thought about doing that? So I want to ask that question just because several people brought that up.
I currently do not, but I am in the process of building a system to do that. That's something I've done on my own. And so far, I'm finding it quite fascinating. I actually think it's going to be much easier than what I'm doing here in the States. because of all the things you talked about with Hong Kong, big fields, consistent racing. It's just, so far it seems a lot easier. The hard part is I have all the basic data, but I'm trying to get that baseline. We talked about pars versus projections. I don't really want to use pars, but I might have to. But I have data from a long way back, so it shouldn't be an issue. But it's something I'll be talking about publicly at some point because I'm finding it pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of the reasons that you gave for why it's harder to make figures now in the United States have been taken care of with Hong Kong. I mean, you have horses you're familiar with. They're all older horses for the most part. There's very few configurations, very accurate timing. They precise weights and they use the weights. Everything we talked about is problematic. Most of that has been, it doesn't exist in Hong Kong. So it seems like from a figure making perspective, it would be kind of like dream setup, but maybe I'm missing something.
No, it does seem that way. I'm a little curious. I mean, obviously they have humongous pools, and I'm sure there are very smart people making speed figures over there, but who knows? Maybe I do something a little bit differently and it could give me a little bit of an edge. I will find out soon enough.
Yeah, well, the thing is, though, there is a lot of, I don't want to be, there's a lot of casual, I'm trying to think of the right word that's not pejorative. There's a lot of casual money in those pools. It's a big pools, but it's not like, there's smart money in there for sure. But there is a lot of casual money in there. So I do think that, that people who aren't, it's not like there's buyer figures in all these horses that everybody's using, that, the casual players are even using. So it does seem like there might be, potential for, just through good speed and pace figures to get an edge in Hong Kong. So I'll be interested to hear about, what you learn and how it goes, because I think, it does seem like for someone like you, it might be an ideal setup because the data is out there for that you can get access to. And a lot of the things that make it problematic today in U.S. racing, those factors don't exist in Hong Kong. So keep us all appraised on how it goes. It'll be very interesting to see.
Yeah.
Where that takes you.
Yeah, the big part of that is I'm quickly approaching 58, and I don't know that staying up till in the middle of the night is going to work out too well. But we'll see. If it's profitable enough, I would make it work.
Well, who knows? Once you get older, you might be waking up and having a hard time sleeping anyway, so you might as well do something while you're awake. Okay, so I usually like to give the guests a chance to kind of weigh in on, if you could do something to improve the game in the U.S., and I'm kind of guessing, I can kind of anticipate your answer on this one, but, what are one or two things that would make the game better for U.S. players? And if you were like Mike Rapoli, the commissioner of racing, you could wave your magic wand, what would you want to change?
So you're probably thinking I'm going to say timing, but I'm going to tell you I've already done that. So I'm not going to talk about that because I really have. It's one of those where the people at Equibase care now. I pretty much have got them to where all the GPS tracks are using beams for start to finish timing. So there's been a lot of good on that front. There's some tracks out there that can do better, but we'll get there eventually. But there's definitely been an improvement. So I would say you mentioned Hong Kong and the smart money in the pools, and there's a lot of casual money. One of the big things they do overseas, including Hong Kong, is they limit how much the CAWs can play. And I think we need to do a much better job here in the United States with that. They're playing way too much of the pools, and it's all secretive. So nobody wants to tell you what it is. And if they don't want to tell you what it is, there's probably a good reason they don't want to tell you what that percentage is. It's because it's way too high. And I think it's making the game it's tough for a guy like me now that does this for a living and spends way too many hours on it. I can't even imagine what it is for the casual player that just, plays on Saturdays and Sundays or Friday afternoons or whatever. They're getting killed. So we need to help the regular horse player and not just CAWs. So I think that would be the big one, is we really need to limit how much they are in the pools, like is being done at a lot of places overseas. If I had to
I think
of
a lot
the
of
second
people...
one. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think a lot of people would agree with what you just said there. But yeah, I'm curious if you have a second one.
The second one would be, I think we just... No, a second one's fine, because I think it's really important. We've hinted at it a little bit in our talks. I think the way we write races in this country needs a complete overhaul, from the weight system to the whole class system to it's just providing us with a shit product. My late good friend Charles Simon used to say, it's the product, stupid. There's a reason why people aren't betting races, and some of it's the betting product's bad because of the CAWs. The other part is the racing product is bad. What's actually happening on the track? We just have too many races. When I open up the PPs, if it's a 9-race card, I can just put a line through like 6 of them because they're not bettable with a 20% takeout. If you bet those races, you're probably going to lose long term. Because our favorites are winning way too much. I haven't checked this year, but I bet we're getting really close to 40%. You see in all the books, 33%. Those days are a long, long time ago. And we're going the way of harness racing. I don't know what the harness racing percentage is now. I bet it's over 40%. And people just don't want to play those kind of games. They're going to find there's way too many alternatives out there with sports betting and whatever else you want to gamble on, you can gamble. So you got to make the product better if you want people to bet horse racing, and just overhauling these races. You have to get bigger fields. If it means running less races, you run less races. That's the way it has to be. You get the same amount of handle running, 10 horse fields as you would 8 6-horse fields, I would bet. So that's just the way I see it. Those are 2 things that we really need to do in this country to make things better.
Well, I'd have to agree on both counts. Anything else you want to add before we wrap it up?
No, I think that's about it. And I'm kind of losing my voice. This is definitely the longest podcast I've ever done.
Yeah, I'm kind of known for doing long podcasts, but it might be the only chance people get to listen to your wisdom on making and using these figures. So hopefully I've learned something, which is true on every one of these. And time's flown by. It's been a while. It's been a long. We spent quite a bit of time, but for me it's been great, and I really appreciate your taking the time. I'm sure the listeners appreciate it, and I also appreciate all the listeners out there. And may you all boldly go where no horse player has gone before.